For our lecture for this week, we are going to be looking at the difference between atheism and theism. Now, that difference might seem obvious at first, but I think it's important to make sure that we correctly and clearly define the terms that we're using in the debate between atheism versus theism. And to get us started, I want to look at an argument that we've already looked at so far in this class, and it's an argument in favor of atheism. This argument is consistent with some of the arguments that were made by Bertrand Russell in the 20th century. If you look at some of the new atheists like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, and others, they have made an argument that is similar to this. And if we were to articulate the argument, it goes like this. So premise one of the argument is that atheism is not a positive belief, but a lack of belief in God. Theism, on the other hand, is a positive belief in the existence of God or in the existence of many gods. 3, positive beliefs and only positive beliefs require evidence if they are to be considered rational. And so these first 3 premises really set up the argument that is going to be made in favor of atheism. So if atheism is sort of a default position, a lack of belief, and theism, on the other hand, is affirming a claim, such as the existence of God, and if it's the case that only positive beliefs require evidence, then we can go to step 4 in the argument, which is on the basis of premises 2 and 3, that theism requires evidence if it's to be considered rational. And that is, if you want to affirm a case for theism, then the burden of proof is on you to present the evidence for it. Whereas atheism does not require evidence to be considered rational, and that's on the basis of 1 and 3. So again, if atheism is a default position, or if it's a lack of belief and not a positive assertion, then one does not need evidence to demonstrate a negative. And the conclusion from this argument is, therefore, given the lack of evidence for theism. Now, of course, that needs to be demonstrated, and so for one to use this argument as an argument for atheism, one will have to show how, say, the traditional arguments for God don't work. But assuming that you can do that, assuming there's a lack of evidence or a lack of substantive argumentation for theism, then it follows that atheism is more rational than theism. So this is an argument that we've already considered, but now I want to look at one response to this claim that was presented by the philosopher Alvin Plantinga. And Plantinga essentially argues that 2 can play the lack of belief game, but it doesn't add to the discussion. Because Plantinga says, I could simply say that I'm an atheist. In other words, I don't have any positive beliefs, I just lack belief in atheism. Now, what is Plantinga saying here? Well, Plantinga is arguing that the way that the typical atheist will argue, at least the atheist who uses this presumption of atheism, default atheism argument, is they will look at, and they think that they're looking at, a bunch of religious believers who are asserting religious ideas. And if these various religions of the world, whether we're talking about Christianity, Islam, whether we're talking about Judaism, Buddhism, etc., all of these religions are asserting claims about their religious faith. And if they're asserting claims, then of course the atheist says you affirm the burden of proof. But then the atheist, of course, comes along and says, well, wait a minute, I think all of you are wrong. You don't have good reasons to believe the things that you say that you believe. And what Plantinga wants to do is he wants to ask, why exactly does the atheist have no burden? If they say that they're just a default lack belief sort of position, well, why can't the theist do the same thing? Why can't the theist say, well, I just lack belief in atheism? Now, to understand what Plantinga is getting at in this argument, I think it would be helpful to look at the article that you're assigned for this week by Michael Peterson, where he talks about the distinction between theism and atheism from a worldview perspective. And on page 438 of your textbook, Peterson writes this: the dispute between theism and atheism is really fundamentally a clash between two opposing explanations of reality. An explanation of everything is what we mean by a worldview. It's a comprehensive conceptual framework that makes sense of important features of life in the world. In other words, what Plantinga gets us to think about here when we compare him with Plantinga's critique of the atheism as a default position, essentially what Peterson is saying is that the reason atheism can't be a mere lack of belief is because atheism must be, by definition, the antithesis of theism. And theism, from a worldview perspective, is a perspective on what's ultimately real. So this is what Peterson and Plantinga are essentially arguing here. They're saying that theism is a metaphysical perspective, and it's a metaphysical perspective that argues that consciousness is the first cause of everything that exists. So now when we think in terms of first cause, we're thinking in terms of a cause that is a necessary reality. And if you're going to say that God is the first cause of all things, well, what exactly could that mean? Well, there are two potential options, at least logically two options. God could be the material first cause. In that sense, you would perceive the material first cause of being something like a brain, and you call the brain God. Or you could say that the first cause is some immaterial first cause, like such as a mind. So God is more like a mind rather than a physical being. Well, generally speaking, theists reject the idea that God is the first material cause. Metaphysical theists usually argue that God is a conscious first cause and God is immaterial, that is, external to the physical universe. Now, if you take that position, metaphysical theism, and you ask what's the antithesis of that, well, the antithesis is metaphysical naturalism or metaphysical materialism, which is to say that the first cause is not conscious, but it's unconscious. And again, you have two ways that you can conceive that unconscious first cause. So if you want to perceive the first cause as being some material thing, one logical way to think about that is to say that the universe is eternal. So there's just always been eternal matter. You can develop some sort of multiverse idea that reality is material, but it might not just be our universe. Maybe there's a parent universe that gave rise to our particular universe, and maybe there's an infinite ensemble of universes. Or you could say that we live in a cyclic world where we know that our universe is expanding. So if you rewind the clock, the universe reduces back to a singularity. But maybe that process has been cyclic for an indefinite amount of time. And so that would be to conceive of metaphysical naturalism as being a material, unconscious first cause. But of course, you could see it also as being an immaterial first cause. So what brought the universe into existence, or what brought all of reality into existence? You could say it was nothing. Maybe you can come up with some sort of mathematical, some numbers. Maybe there's physical laws that actually are not physical, but they exist outside of the space-time universe. Maybe you can conceptualize some sort of Platonic forms. But either way, the debate between theism and atheism is really a debate between metaphysical naturalism versus metaphysical theism, which is to say it's a debate between an unconscious first cause versus a conscious first cause. And therefore, the question in the debate is whether or not there's any reason to prefer one position over the other. Now, when we get into answering that question, we essentially get to the nature of causation. And that's where we're going to be spending the rest of our time in this lecture. So there are three basic types of causation that we can think of here. We can think of what's called chance causation, which is to say that when event A happens, it can bring about either event B or effect B or effect C. So there is a chance that one or two or more possible outcomes can happen based upon some prior cause, versus necessary causation, which is when cause A happens, necessarily effect A will happen as a result. There are no alternatives. Now, there is a debate when it comes to causation, whether or not chance causation really is a thing. So there are some philosophers who argue that chance does not exist as an ontological reality. Instead, chance is just an expression of our ignorance of the causes that brought about a certain effect. So you could think of flipping a coin. When you flip a coin and you catch it and you put it on the back of your hand, the question is, what are the chances that it's heads? Most people will say the chances are 50-50. Well, you could argue that it's really not a 50-50 chance, because when you use chance in that way, all you're saying is that you don't know how much force was put on the coin when you flipped it in the air. You don't know the various factors of resistance that's on the coin. You don't know how high your hand is going to be when you catch the coin. But if you could determine all the relevant factors, you would realize that it's not a 50-50 chance, but everything that happens in that series of cause and effect has a determined outcome. And if there's a determined outcome, then you could say that there's only necessary causation, there's not chance causation. Now, we're not going to settle that debate here. For now, it's just helpful to conceptualize the two different types of causation, that there's chance causation and necessary causation. And it's also important to note that both of those types of causes are unconscious causes. Now, they're not necessarily first causes, but a chance causation would be a cause brings about an effect for no conscious reason. It's not planned, it's not purposed. The same is the case when it comes to necessary causation. Here you can think about physical laws of nature. And now you can contrast that with the idea of agent causation, or the notion of design. So in agent causation, you have an agent, a person, who is bringing about a particular effect. And so one of the things that we need to think about when we think about the debate between metaphysical naturalism versus metaphysical theism is whether or not agent causation is a real thing. And if so, how does agent causation become part of the reality that we live in? And so with that in mind, we could consider a case for naturalism. Now, this case for naturalism that I'm going to be looking at is expressed clearly in Richard Dawkins' book, The Blind Watchmaker, where Dawkins is essentially going to argue that there is no design in nature. And he's also going to argue that what we've learned from science, specifically his area of science, biological evolution, what we've learned is that nature is demonstrating that even though some things may appear to be designed for a purpose, there are actually clear evolutionary mechanisms that explain the apparent design of life. And in Dawkins' book, he says, even though atheism was logically tenable before Darwin, that is, before Darwin's theory of natural selection, Dawkins argues that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Now, I want to consider why Dawkins argues this. And we're going to go back to a philosopher, pastor named John Ray, who wrote a famous book in the late 1600s called The Wisdom of God Manifested in the Works of Creation, where he presents a design argument for the existence of God. So again, we're trying to think what types of causes exist in reality. Is everything brought about by chance and necessity alone, or the combination of the two, or are there some effects that are brought about by design? Now, Ray mentions many examples in his book that give the appearance of design, at least. So he talks about how orderly the heavenly bodies appear to be. the rotation of the earth, the fact that birds can fly. He thinks of birds as being designed to fly, the complexity of the human eye, or even just how the brain and the mind work together. These are all types of examples that John Ray points to, and he says if we have these systems in the natural world, then clearly we must think that there's design in nature, and if there's design in nature, there must be a designer. This type of argument was also put forward by thinkers like Isaac Newton, who pointed to the beautiful system of the sun, planets, and comets. And he says these could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. So there is a long history of design arguments for theism, but probably the most sophisticated version of the design argument was presented by the philosopher William Paley. And Paley has this stonemaker argument or watchmaker argument where he considers somebody who's walking in the wilderness and stumbles across a stone. Now, if you stumble across a normal stone, you wouldn't just immediately think, wow, there must have been somebody who designed this stone, because a stone doesn't have the types of properties that make you infer that it must be designed. But he says, if I'm walking through the woods and I stumble across a watch, well, in that case, I immediately think that there must be a watchmaker. And to understand Paley's argument, I think it's helpful to try to list out the characteristics between a watch and a stone. And this might be a helpful exercise for you to do as you're watching this at home. So when you look at a watch versus a stone, what are some characteristics? Try to list them out that specifically give credence to your inference that the watch must be designed versus the stone. So what is it about the watch that makes you say this must be designed whereas the stone is not? And now as you think about whatever list you come up with, now use that same list and compare the watch to, say, the human eye. So if you compare the watch to the human eye, does the eye have the same types of characteristics that make you infer that the watch was designed? Can you use those same characteristics and apply that to the human eye? And if you can, Paley says you have an argument for design, and thus he writes, there cannot be a design without a designer, contrivance without a contriver, order without choice, or arrangement without anything capable of arranging. So again, you have to think of what type of cause arranged the eye in this particular way. Paley argues that it must be designed, and so there must be an agent that designed the eye to be this way. Now, when Richard Dawkins looks at this argument, he says there were critiques of this design argument before Darwin. And specifically, he is thinking about somebody like David Hume. So David Hume, in his Dialogues Concerning Natural Religion, did present arguments against the design argument. And Dawkins considers these to be logical arguments against design. And so they still can be powerful, but they're not scientific arguments against design. So Hume argued, for example, that we can't argue from the parts to the whole. So in other words, what Hume is saying is that humans will look at something like a watch, and a watch is just part of the universe. But you can't say because this one part of the universe is designed, therefore we apply that to the whole universe itself. That's to commit the fallacy of arguing from the parts to the whole. Or he would also say that the universe is not the same type of thing as an artifact. So we're not comparing the right types of things. It's not a fair comparison here. The universe is wholly different than a human artifact is, and so we shouldn't make that analogy. Furthermore, he says that arguments from analogy work only when we have a point of reference. And when it comes to the universe, there's only one reference. There's only one universe. And so to consider this whole notion of analogy further, Hume sets up kind of a continuum to think about whether or not the analogy from design is good, from human artifacts to the universe, or whether it's weak. And he says, on the one hand, if you consider the analogy from human design and compare that to the universe as a whole, if you say there's a strong analogy there, then you're going to commit the sin of anthropomorphism, which is to say that you're making God very much like a human. So if you say that human design is just like the design of the universe, then that is necessarily to bring God down to a human level and to make God more human and more human-like. But of course, if you say, well, no, we don't want to make God more human-like, we want to say that God is transcendent, God is infinite, God is way above humans, well, then once you start going to that end of the continuum, then you have to admit that there are weak analogies between what God can do and what humans can do. But in either case, the design argument doesn't work from Hume's perspective. So if it's a strong analogy, then God isn't so big and infinite. But of course, if it's a weak analogy, then the design argument doesn't work. And so you can't use this argument, says Hume, to make a case for theism, for sure not for some form of Christian theism. Now there's another really important argument that Hume brings up at this point, and that is that the design of the universe also has some obvious flaws. And Hume really provides an early version of what later would become known as the problem of dysteleology, which was first presented by Ernest Haeckel. And sometimes this is called the problem of suboptimal design. And essentially what this argument is stating is that if you want to say that things that seem intricately designed give evidence for an intelligent designer, then what do you do with things that do not seem so intelligently designed? If you say the beauty that we see in the world must be evidence for a beautiful artist, well, why isn't the ugliness of the world something that would be attributed to somebody who is not such a great artist? And to get a good picture of this, I want to watch this video of the so-called design of the praying mantis to see exactly what Hume is getting at with this suboptimal design argument.
This mantis is at the top of her game. All summer, she's been bulking up on grasshoppers and flies. They're called bordered mantises, ambush hunters, cloaked by camouflage, some green and some brown. And check out those forelimbs. They're lined with sharp spikes, almost like a couple extra sets of jaws to grab her prey. They've served her well. But summer is coming to an end here in California's Owens Valley. The one thing left for them to do is start the next generation. She sends out a chemical signal, an alluring cocktail of pheromones into the air. This guy picks up the message. He's way, way smaller than she is. Simply outclassed when it comes to strength and deadliness. He makes his move to pass on his genes for... that's one way to go. And he's not the only male to meet his end this way. So why would praying mantises do this? Eat their own kind at a rather intimate moment? Seems like they wouldn't last long as a species. Well, it takes a ton of energy for females to produce their eggs, about 100 of them, developing inside her. She'll lay them in a foamy cluster like this, called an ootheca. So that male is fueling the survival of his species, nutritionally speaking. When they hatch in the spring, there'll be plenty more mantises to replace this one. And these bordered mantises weren't going to live much longer anyway. They can't survive the cold autumn nights. So males might as well take a shot. Aw, this time it worked out. He delivers a packet of sperm to fertilize her eggs. But each time, it's a serious gamble. Well, that didn't go so well. But wait, look. He's been decapitated, but his body is still moving. Like it's on autopilot. Kind of a zombie mating machine. It's being controlled by nerves in the mantis's abdomen and can still get the job done. In fact, males who successfully mate and get eaten in the process may father more eggs than those who get away. So, while it might not really seem that way, this guy may be the ultimate winner in the primal quest to pass on his genes.
And so if you think of the reproduction system of the praying mantis as being something that is designed, then Hume would bring up the question of how could this be optimally designed, or how could a designer who's any good, good morally speaking, or just good in terms of engineering, how could any good designer make a system like this? And so that would be a critique of the design argument from the perspective of design being suboptimal. There's other examples that could be brought up. So when it comes to the design of the eye, so this has been kind of a standard case that has been used since Pele and even before Pele of being an example of a system that must be designed. Well, somebody who makes an argument for dysteleology, they might point out that some of the wiring of the eye is backwards. For example, the cones and the rods of the eye are wired backwards so that when light passes into the eye to the back of the retina, light has to pass through a bunch of ganglion cells and bipolar cells before it actually hits the cones and the rods. And that's not something that the argument goes that an engineer would do. And so if we ask this in the form of a question, we might say, if the universe provides examples of suboptimal design, does this undermine belief in God, or does it undermine belief in some sort of good God? So all of this argument put forward by David Hume provides the logical response to design in nature. But if you want the fulfilled response, again, to use Dawkins' words, we need to get to Charles Darwin. So Dawkins says that Darwin made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. Now, to understand what Dawkins means by this, it's helpful to look at some of the works of Charles Darwin. So one of the things that's interesting about Darwin, and if you ever have a chance to read The Origin of Species, I recommend reading it. I also recommend reading it back to back or alongside with William Paley's Natural Theology, because there's many places where it seems obvious that Darwin is making a direct response to Paley's overall argument. And in fact, in the letter that Charles Darwin writes to one of his companions, he says, I do not think I hardly ever admired a book more than Paley's Natural Theology. He very much had high regards for Pele. It was, compared to its time, a very good work of not simply theology, but it was a very good work of science. And he says, I could almost formally have said this book by heart. Now, it's interesting then when you go to his Origin of Species to see the responses that he gives to Pele. For example, when it comes to the design of the eye. Darwin writes, to suppose that the eye, with all of its inimitable contrivances for adjusting the focus to different distances, for admitting different amounts of light, and for the correction of spherical and chromatic aberration, to suppose that all of that could have been formed by natural selection seems, I freely confess, absurd in the highest degree possible. Yet, he goes on to say, reason tells me that if numerous gradations from perfect and complex eyes to one very imperfect and simple, with each grade being useful to its possessor, can be shown to exist, then the difficulty of believing that a perfect and complex eye could be formed by natural selection, though insuperable by our imagination, can hardly be considered real. In other words, if you consider what his idea of natural selection contributes to biology, and you think about how that process works, so you have some random variation within an organism, but that variation is being selected either for good or for bad by natural selection, then if you have enough time, you can get from any degree of simplicity to any degree of complexity using Darwin's theory. And so Darwin's really two central ideas in the Origin of Species is idea number one, that there's universal common ancestry, and two, that natural selection working on random variations can bring about various degrees of complexity. So now if we go back to our understanding of causation, essentially what Dawkins' theory gives us is a way of thinking about apparent design in nature. So natural selection would be a mode of causation that is brought about by necessity. So you have necessary causation there. It's a very law-like. It's not random at all. But then when you get to chance, this is some sort of undefined random variation. So we don't necessarily understand why the variations happen. But if you couple chance and necessity working together, what Darwin argues and what Dawkins argues in his Blind Watchmaker is that that is a better argument for the apparent design than the actual design hypothesis. Now, to back up that response, you can look at the evidence for biological evolution. And if you want to survey some of this material, you can look at the article by Michael Roos on page 429 of your textbook. But when we're talking about design existing in nature, Roos says that we're thinking about design in terms of a metaphor. At least this is what happens after Darwin. Because natural selection is capable of producing design-like entities. So eyes and hands are certainly design-like. But if you consider what we know from biology, specifically from, say, comparative anatomy, you can see that things that give the appearance of design are not designed, at least top-down design, when you look at these structures compared to each other. So, for example, you might say that hands are designed for, say, grabbing a pencil. But if you look at the structure of the bones in the hands, so you have, going all the way up to the arm, you have the humerus, the radius. You basically have the same pattern in all mammals. You have one bone, two bones, many bones, and then you have the phalanges. You have that same exact structure, whether we're looking at cats, whales, or bats. But in each case, that same exact design is used for a different purpose. And so even though it looks design-like, what we learn from mutations and natural selection working together and from the evidence from comparative anatomy is that things that are apparently designed on closer inspection are not necessarily designed. And thus you have Dawkins' statement, although atheism might have seemed logically tenable before Darwin, Darwin is actually the one who made it possible to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. So this is the general case for naturalism. That is, chance and necessity working together can bring us all the various complexity that we see in the world today. And so you need some sort of case like this to make the argument for atheism. When we get to our upcoming lectures, we will see whether or not the various cases that are made for theism, can provide better alternatives than the case for naturalism.